With that, I'll call to order the council meeting of Tuesday, September the 25th. Are there any changes, additions to the agenda? Seeing none, I'll move the agenda be approved as presented. Those in favor, opposed, motion's carried unanimously. First item of business is a public hearing for Bylaw 2018-16, amendment to the Municipal Development Plan. And in the published agenda, there's the description of the process. So after an administrative briefing and questions of clarification from council, there's an opportunity for input from the public, and then final administrative comments. And then we'll move on. So, Mr. Fark, you're presenting.
Good evening, Mayor Borman, members of council. So this is the public hearing for the MDP amendment for Bylaw 2018-16, which is a third-party environmental impact statement amendment. So the MDP, as it currently reads, clause 18.2.15, the preparation, scope, content, and review of an EIS policy shall be in accordance with the town's EIS policy. That policy also states that whenever an EIS is prepared, the town will contract a qualified professional to conduct an independent third-party review of the EIS. Council or administration is proposing an amendment to this wording, and I'll just. Oh, shall I hold off while we bring it back to life? Thank you. Okay, I shall resume.
We're back on air. Yep. Okay, so what is the reason why administration is bringing forward this amendment? Well, first, it's important to set some context and some understanding of what the policy is and what it is intended to achieve. So the MDP, as it's currently written, gives council the discretion to decide if an EIS is required in certain circumstances. So there's a list of criteria that sets out when an EIS may be required, but it also gives council the discretion to waive the requirement for an EIS. However, the current wording of the MDP doesn't allow discretion for council to waive the requirement for a third-party review where an EIS is required. An EIS is a study that is meant to determine the environmental impacts of a given development. The intent of the policy, as established by council, is that we place the obligation to provide the EIS on a developer when that development is coming forward. The intent of the third-party review is to ensure that there is an independent expert who reviews the work of the developer's consultant. The concern being that if a developer is able to hire the consultant and direct their work, they could direct the work in such a way as to not represent the interests of the municipality. So council's policy direction is that the town will retain our own third-party reviewer at town cost. It is not a cost that is recovered from the developer. It is at town cost to ensure that the town interests are represented and that the EIS is done to an appropriate standard. Administration's understanding of the intent of the policy is to ensure transparency and protection of town interests. The challenge comes in is that the MDP provides no indication of what should happen when the town is itself the developer. So council and administration are by definition required to act in the town interest or the public interest. That is the nature of our work. When we hire an independent consultant to do an EIS, administration goes through the process of tendering and evaluating applications, and then hiring the consultant, and then working with them to develop the scope to ensure that the public interest is represented and that the scope of the work is appropriate. It is administration's position that hiring yet another consultant to review that first consultant's work is redundant and that it comes at a considerable extra cost to the town. Our analogy would be that currently we have the town hires an auditor to audit the financials for the town, and that auditor is a Vail. A similar process would be if we were to hire a separate auditor, for example, KPMG, to audit a Vail's audit of the town. That would be a similar level of review. It's a level of redundancy. And in both cases, it is administration who is responsible for contracting the consultant. So there's a practical example of why we are wanting to make this change. This is not theoretical, and it was presented when we brought this forward for first reading. So we have an example of a water line project that we require in order to do looping. It ensures pressure for, sufficient pressure for fire response and capacity in certain neighborhoods that are currently or in the future likely to have some constraints around water supply. It needs to cross the tipple site, which is an area that would require an EIS. So administration doesn't want to come to council and say, do not require an EIS in this case, because we actually are of the opinion that there are valid environmental considerations that we need to be informed about and that need to be considered in the design and implementation of this project. Administration wants to see the EIS move forward. Where we're challenged is that we do not see that the additional resources required for the third-party review is justified in this type of case. This is a current example of a project that is awaiting award of tender now that is on hold for this decision. But as we look at our utility master plan and our other master plan projects going forward, there are a number of these types of projects that we anticipate in the coming years. So we're not just fixing this as a one-time for one particular project. This is something that we're looking to address for the long term. And just as a note, the cost of a third-party review when they are done is substantial. So of the ones we have done recently, even for a relatively small project, limited scope, generally speaking, they are not coming in less than $30,000. They are quite expensive. So what are we looking to do? We're looking to amend the clause, so 18.2.15, as stated there. Whenever an EIS is prepared, the town will contract a qualified professional to conduct an independent third party of the EIS. Notwithstanding the above, the requirement for an independent third-party review of an EIS does not apply to any EIS prepared by or on behalf of the town. So again, a recent example, the Palliser development. Although the town was involved in that project and we sponsored that project in many ways, that was not a town-led project, and it required both an EIS and a third-party review. So that is not a scenario where a third-party review would not have been required had this policy change been made at that time. Oh, that recommendation is for later. So that concludes the administration presentation for the public hearing. I am happy to answer any questions for clarity.
Thank you very much. I have some questions. Councillor Mary, you have a question.
Sure. Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you for your report, Mr. Clark. I'm just assuming that all three EISs are conducted by three separate companies, correct?
So which three EISs are you referring to?
The EIS for each, like the third part, like there's the one done by whoever's doing the project.
Right. Yes.
And then there's the one that the town does.
No, so there's only one EIS.
Okay.
So on any project, one EIS is conducted by a consultant, and then the town, we call it a third-party reviewer. It's not the third person in the line. It's just an independent reviewer, right? So we hire the consultant to do the EIS, or the developer hires the consultant to do the EIS, and then we hire a separate consultant to review their work.
And these are available to the public?
Yes, they are. They generally come to council as part of the decision-making process for whatever development it is that is moving forward.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Fark. So just to be clear, the way the MDP is currently worded, we only have two choices. One is to have a third-party review on any project that it requires it. And the other is for administration to come to council and waive the need for a review at all, for an EIS at all.
That's correct. It's either no EIS or an EIS and a third-party review.
And you're saying that in our situation, or in a town situation, an EIS could be required, but a third-party review is not a necessary step.
That's right. In the position of administration, it would be redundant and at considerable cost.
So has there ever been a situation where the town has done an EIS and a third-party review for itself?
No, I believe that this project that is coming forward now would be the first time that that would need to occur.
And so this is where you've identified this
That is correct.
slight gap in the wording that doesn't necessarily meet the needs, because now we're coming up to it?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Comfort?
Yes, thank you for your presentation, Mr. Park. So can you envision any circumstances where a third-party review would be needed on a town-led project?
Personally, I cannot. Somebody recently asked me, for example, about a future athletes' village for the Olympics, which would be a large, complex project that would, under the current definitions, require an EIS. So again, our understanding, the EIS is meant to be a robust and thorough environmental review. The concern or the reason for the third-party reviewer is that if the EIS is produced by somebody other than the town, then we can't be confident that the EIS is produced with the town's best interest, the community's best interest, taken fully into consideration. Whereas, even for the athletes' village, for example, if the town is leading that process, we are by definition required, it is our job description, to act in the community in the public interest. And so the EIS at that point, from my perspective, would need to be as thorough and as robust as required to meet the intent of the policy. So I would struggle to understand what the added value of a third-party reviewer would be. If council felt that there was sufficient complexity to the project, that they wanted additional resources mobilized to help with that, I mean, that is something that could be considered on a case-by-case basis, I could imagine. But I can't envision a scenario where a town project being executed by the town would require a third-party review if you are of the opinion that the job of council and administration is to act in the public interest.
So, with permission, Your Worship, I have, I guess, sort of a follow-up, or just a clarification. The EIS is not conducted by the town. It's conducted on behalf of the town by an independent consultant.
That's correct, yes. And those consultants, same like engineers, they have a professional code of ethics that they are required to do. There are professional standards that they are required to meet. So even in the case of a developer bringing an application forward, we have a reasonable degree of confidence in the work that their consultant will do, because they are beholden not just to their client, but to a governing body and to a code of ethics, essentially. And that would be the same in the case of the town hiring a consultant, is they have an obligation to us as their client, but they have other professional obligations as well. And given that, especially for development proposals where the EIS will come forward to council, the EIS will be scrutinized and will be available for public and would be part of review. So I believe there would also be reputational risk and considerations there for a consultant in terms of ensuring that their work is thorough and correct.
Thank you.
So just exploring your comment on the possibility of a future athletes village, the town, as I understand it, would be obliged to deliver that project that's within the current planning discussion. So the town is obliged to provide the athletes village, which from my perspective makes it a town project. Mm-hmm. And if this was if this amendment were approved for the MDP, then we wouldn't be obliged to provide a third-party review. We would certainly do an EIS. And your point, I suppose, is that, or your question is, what's the value of a second opinion on the environmental impact? Earlier you did reference the independent audit report that's done, and there's no third-party review of an audit. What other, I know there's a number of other impact statements that are fairly typical, particularly in development approvals. Economic impact statement, for instance. How many other statements or processes like that are there that are often associated with an approval?
So there are a number of them. We do a traffic impact assessment oftentimes for development. We will do a financial impact assessment oftentimes for development. There is, I mean, we do a UMP, a utility master plan, which is done by an independent consultant to look at our planning over a number of years and whether we are planning appropriately. We have the audit, the financial audit, for example. These are a number of examples. The only impact, or the only review process that we go through that has a requirement for a third party is the EIS. So there's nothing else that we do, not traffic, not finances, etc., that requires a third party review. It is only in the case of the environmental.
Could you describe in a bit more detail how the terms of reference for the EIS is developed and approved?
So in the case of a developer coming forward, so the town then contracts our independent third-party reviewer, and administration works with the third-party reviewer and the consultant for the developer to set out the terms of reference, to define the scope, and to ensure that the study area and the components are all appropriate to the scale of the development. In the case of going forward, if this amendment were to be passed on a town-only project, the expectation would be that administration would work directly with the EIS consultant through the same process to define the scope, to look at the components, and to ensure that the work is complete.
The current project, which is essentially driven this discussion at this time, the South Canmore water main loop across the Tipple field. Other than it crossing the Tipple field, I mean, environmentally sensitive area, once it's built, what impact would it have on the environment in any way?
Well,
I mean, it's an underground.
It's an underground. It does cross two water bodies, and so that is an additional complication. The clear answer is the reason why we are proposing and administration would like to see an EIS done on this project is because we don't know for sure. We anticipate the fact that it will be a buried cable or buried pipe, that it will have minimal, if any, long-term impact on the environment. But we would like to have that validated by the EIS process. Similarly, the EIS also looks at the during construction component as well, and what mitigations may be required in order to ensure that we minimize the impact during the construction phase. That's also an important consideration from our perspective.
There's other questions, but I'll just finish this line of thought. So I don't, personally, I don't see any benefit coming from a third-party review of a competent EIS on buried water main. But I'm not confident, I'm not 100% certain that there may not be other projects that the town leads that might benefit from a third-party review of an EIS. I'm not certain about that as I think about this. So one question that I have in my mind is, would there be a way of, without making for an even worse situation, having it set up so that there would be an opportunity for various projects to come to council to make a decision on whether or not a third-party review would be beneficial or not? So
the wording in the current MDP allows council the flexibility to determine whether or not an EIS is required. You could certainly amend the language to extend that same discretion to council also for a third-party review. So that could be a potential solution if that was council's direction. That is a potential solution, yes.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Seeley, is that your phone ringing?
Wasn't my phone. Or maybe it was.
Mr. Fark, just wondering about how the MGA would guide a municipality in respect to this.
So the MGA speaks at a high level to what council must consider when looking at a development application, usually at the higher level, and it only sets out that council may or should consider environmental components, financial components, etc. The MGA does not go to the level of prescribing whether or not an EIS is required or whether or not a third-party review is required. It remains the level of ensuring that council considers environmental factors, for example.
And how would it view a municipality as opposed to a developer? Is there a differentiator? There
is. So the MGA is very clear that a municipality is not an independent developer, and it is clear in the MGA that municipalities are not required to treat themselves in the same manner as they treat a developer.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Fark. So I just wanted to confirm, because we've gotten some emails today that seem to be confused, and that is that the third-party review isn't actually independent of the town. We're choosing the biologist or the scientist to do the EIS, and then we're also going to choose the third-party reviewer to do the review. So in both instances, both scientists are being contracted and are under, well, could be considered to be beholden to the town of Canmore, which is the straight reason why you're flagging this for council as being redundant.
Correct.
Okay,
yes.
I just wanted to make that clear, because there's seemed to be some confusion in some of the, that somebody up here somewhere else chooses that scientist.
They both get their work at the direction of administration, and the role of the third-party reviewer is to review the work of the EIS. It's not to do an independent EIS and then compare the results. Right? So we work with them to define the scope, the terms of reference, and then they review the work done by the EIS consultant.
And I don't think somebody asked this question earlier. Maybe it was something that discussed earlier today. How many other municipalities in Canmore, in Alberta or in the country, perform third-party review on their environmental impact statements?
That is a question I cannot answer. I mean, every municipality has their version of an EIS, and they are common. I don't know if Mr. Fish has any example. We are unaware. My expectation is that the third-party review is probably an exceptional as opposed to normative.
All right. Thank you very kindly.
Councillor Hillstead.
Both of my questions have been answered by. She stole that one, Councillor Comfort stole one.
You've got to be quicker on the button.
I got no questions because they've been answered.
Councillor Stanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. So what I think I'm hearing you saying is that the language in the clause 18.2.15 states that you need to hire a qualified professional. So that qualified professional would be vetted by the town, and then the third-party review would also be vetted by the town. But you are held to a standard of hiring a qualified professional to do this work.
That is correct, yes.
So the fact that that's in the language constrains you to a limited scope of who you can hire to do the EIS.
Yes. And simply what we're proposing is that in the cases where the town is the developer, one qualified professional to do the work is sufficient.
Okay. I just wanted to clear that up because I think that was language that was new in the MDP.
In the last round of the MDP.
In the last round.
That is correct.
Thank you.
So, in your opinion, what value is added by having a third-party review done on a EIS that's prepared by a private developer in the private sector?
So once again, I believe that there are a series of checks and balances already in place to ensure that anybody who is engaging in a professional service is meeting professional requirements. So again, engineers, they have a code of ethics, and there is a governing body. Same with geophysicists, I believe, same with biologists as well. So there's already a mechanism in place to govern, to ensure that they're doing professional work and that they are not just doing their work to appease their client. Right? So I think that there is already a robust system in place. However, I do agree that there is value in the third-party review because although there is a robust mechanism in place, there is still the outstanding concern that the developer is the client of the consultant, and people often choose to work in such a way as to please their clients or to get the outcomes that the client desires. So having an independent third-party review done by the town of a developer application gives council, who is ultimately deciding whether or not the project is in the public good, and I think this is the most important consideration, is any development application that is coming to council for a decision, ultimately council is deciding whether it is in the public good. The landowner has land rights, absolutely, and those must be respected. But in addition to that, council must determine that that development is in the public good. And so having that third-party review gives council the confidence to be absolutely sure that the due diligence has been completed, and therefore that the public good has been represented and is well represented.
So in that, from that perspective, in regards to private sector, I think you're quite right, because it does come back to council ultimately to inform council decision. In the case of a town-led project like the water main, it doesn't come to council, it just comes to administration.
That's correct.
So the environmental impact statement would inform administration in their decision on how to mitigate against environmental impact from the water main.
That's correct.
So you noted, just playing devil's advocate here, you noted that the possibility exists for a professional consultant who's been hired by private sector to provide an EIS might shape their response because they know what the
Desired outcome is.
the desired outcome is. Why would that not be likely if it was the town who was the
So, fair question. And once again, the response would be, first of all, the town, via council or administration, we are by definition required to act in the public interest. So I'm trying hard to imagine a project that administration would have a vested interest in getting approved despite environmental concerns. So I'm having a hard time envisioning a scenario where that would occur. And the interest of the town is protected through the work that is done by the EIS consultant. Mr. Fish, you had something to add?
Well, I'm hesitant to suggest this scenario, but if the town were to hire a consultant to conduct the initial EIS with some nefarious objective, say, for example, to ignore the impacts on water quality or something like that, if that is the assumption, would not the assumption carry forward that in hiring the third-party reviewer, we would also direct the third-party reviewer to ignore the water quality impact? I mean, I'm hesitant to suggest that, but that's the duplication, because, as Mr. Fark pointed out, the town is directing both consultants. Yeah. We will act in the common good as best as we can interpret that. And if we are hiring a second consultant, we are almost certainly going to give them very similar direction on a project to review the impacts.
Yeah. So ultimately, if the question is one of there being a lack of confidence in the motivation of administration and the execution of its work, then my suggestion would probably be you have a bigger problem than the wording in the MDP. And that the appropriate step may be, therefore, to address that problem as opposed to hiring a third-party consultant as a redundancy and an additional cost to the taxpayer. Because I would argue then that the taxpayer is then doubly ill-served. Ill-served by having an administration that council cannot trust, and then ill-served by having to spend additional money for a third-party review due to that mistrust.
Councillor Hillstead?
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you for your presentation. Talking about costs, you said that EIS, like the lowest amount was 30,000. What's the upper limit that we've seen so far with third-party reviews?
So in the neighborhood of 6 figures. Yeah, 90, 100,000 in that area for the larger, more complex. Yeah.
Thank you.
And to be clear, that is money that the town does not recover from the developer in the case of a private development coming forward, specifically to ensure the independence of the work that we do.
Thank you.
So the current project that we've talked about a bit, the water main, I think you indicated that it's ready to tender.
That's correct, yes.
And
ready to award. The tender has already been done.
Ready to award, sorry. And there's an urgency to award.
To preserve the pricing that we receive through the
Right,
tender process,
okay.
yes.
And so hesitation on awarding the tender may have a financial impact,
Yes,
right, over and above the cost of a third-party review.
that is correct.
You mentioned there were a number of other similar projects coming up over the next year, say.
Mhm.
Can you detail any of those or provide any other detail of those?
So there would be some lift station upgrades. There's some additional work that we plan to do at the wastewater treatment plant, which is in a habitat patch. All of those projects would require an EIS and a third-party review under the current wording.
So project at the water treatment plant.
Yes, and of which there are several that are anticipated to come forward.
So thinking backwards, the project we just completed this year, I think, or is maybe not quite completed, started a couple of years ago with a provincial grant.
So that, the approval for that predated
Yeah.
the change in the MDP
So under the
policy.
current NDP, that would require a third-party review.
That is correct, yes.
Okay, are there other questions from members of council? So I'm struggling with whether or not to, I hate putting a motion on the table at.
Mayor Borman, may I interrupt? Yeah, the public hearing is yet to occur, so we're not yet at the point of,
Yeah.
so we should probably allow the public hearing to, before speaking to
Yeah,
whether or
no,
not to bring forward a motion.
I think I had a question there. I think I was leading up to a question.
My apologies.
It had to do with an amendment, we talked briefly about it.
Yes.
And I think you understand what I'm
What your concern
looking
is.
for.
Mhm.
Speak to that again. What you had referenced some opportunity within the MDP that,
So currently, the MDP provides discretion to council to determine when an EIS is required. So it sets out criteria of when an EIS would be considered, but it also gives council the ability to say an EIS is not required for a particular project. So there could be an opportunity to amend the language of the MDP and the EIS policy to allow similar discretion for the third-party review. Essentially make it a decision of council when a third-party review is or is not required.
okay, did you want to add something to that?
Yes, just to expand on Mr. Fark's response, another alternative would be during budget deliberations when council is establishing the capital plan, if there was a project that was going to be proceeding that council was concerned about, you could make it a condition of the approval of that capital project that an EIS and a third-party review occur. Because that tends to be, it's the capital budget approval time that council has most discretion over the scope of the project that's going to proceed. So that would be an opportunity for council to weigh in and suggest that that was a project that you were concerned about.
Right. And sorry, just to be clear, Mr. Fish has provided a very useful clarification. So the discretion in the MDP only applies to a new ASP or amending an ASP. Right. So there are a number of other types of development that could occur in which there is no discretion for council to waive the requirement for the EIS, and therefore currently no discretion to waive the requirement for the third-party review.
Okay, thanks. Councilor McCallum?
Thank you, Your Worship. I just wanted to follow up with Ms. DeSoto on what she just said. So you would be suggesting that perhaps during budget, when town projects are coming forward, projects that we know are going to require an EIS regardless, at that point we could decide based on the size and scope of that project whether or not we thought a third-party review would be necessary. I had wondered that myself actually last night while I was reading through the material a second time.
The reality is that depending on the decision of council, we would have to budget for the third-party review as part of the scope of the project, because it's a significant cost that is associated with the project.
That's part of your budgeting anyway, so that would be a good time to know whether that those dollars would need to be attached to that project in addition to what's budgeted already.
Yes.
That's an interesting idea. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Any other questions then for administration at this time? Seeing none, thank you very much. So I will open it for public submissions. If there's anybody who'd like to speak to the to council on this matter, I think we'll do the usual format where we'll alternate somebody that wants to speak in support or opposed or in a neutral manner. So I welcome anybody who would like to speak in opposed to come to the floor. And we'll use the timer. Mr. Kendi, you know the drill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor and councillors. At 82, I starting to learn what the right manner, what the bad manner. As I read it in that door, I got the message. Anyway, I like to do a very short presentation, which is not a presentation, but if I could go one by one of the questions, what I think is wrong with this. Number one, I think first time in my life, so rapidly I agree with you that we were doubt about that, the second opinion. And we need a second opinion for the simple reason is when you go to a general practitioner, you will have a second opinion. If you go to the surgeon, you will have a second opinion, because this is a science which is under no circumstances rightfully could be compared to the bean contest presentation. The bean contest says 50 plus 50 is 100. I never saw an EIS when it's so concrete and says what is possible, what it should be, what it should not be done, because it's a science. And because it's a science, there is no 100% answer on it. So if you get the science, it's going to have his opinion, and what's preferable, what's not preferable, I don't suggest. The science will say you can't build a skyscraper in the middle of the wildlife corridor, but that's as far as they can go. So I think the government wasting all their money when they're paying our general practitioners, surgeon, and whatever, twice to look me up, to make sure that I have a sustainable life. Your question that was, where is it coming? Appointing these two consultants. Number one, that is a thing what we've been looked over now for a generation, council generation since mine. There's no tendering, to the best of my knowledge. Certainly no public opening for tendering. So yes, under the present regime, the third party is almost useless because the same people appointing these very professional people. But because they're professional, I got no much problem with it, till our chief planner said that we're giving a direction to them, and they're going to come out with the same answer. I take exception for it. I have a profession. I never took a direction what they want to hear from my counsel. My professional integrity is more that let me influence by the customer or which direction I should go. They give me a job, and I give them various alternatives and give them my opinion. So that doesn't work. Talking about the start of the thing, if one developer needs 2 of these IS, environmental study, a development is a development, sir, councilors. There is no difference between brown, black, yellow, or white people. There is no development, no difference between developments. So if one needs that, all needs it. Providing it needs it because it's big enough. I think that's the problem, is that why we need that. Because these EISs are not perfectly tell you a direction. 5 and 5 is 10. So we get an interpretation from our town manager or that planning, and that's what you get. And these interpretation, because it's discretionary, they have all the rights to criticize it and tell you direction, influence you in the right way. That's their interpretation. And that interpretation, you have to see it from 2 different directions, where it's come from, not from one direction, who dreams up the job, gives out the jobs, give a direction, and then you get it back, what basically, on a professional way, loosey-goosey, the contractor will agree with the person who approved it. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anybody at this time that would like to speak in support of the matter or in a neutral position? Is there anybody else here that'd like to speak in an opposed manner? We try not to get into any sort of a debate. It's really just an opportunity to hear from the public.
I'd like to say that we've already made a submission.
Sure, there's written submissions that council's received all of, and they'll be read into the record almost right away. Yes, they, for the most part, came in today. So if there's no other spoken submissions, I'll then look to Ms. Cardinal to read into the record the names of those who provided written submissions.
All of these submissions were opposed, and the names are Naya Noise West, I apologize if I mispronounce the names, Kay and Gary Anderson, Tom Bartley, Barbara Bano, Renee Boone, Boda, Courtney Burke, Ward Cameron, Blanca Servi, Lisa Downing, Rachel Gauck, Wendy Hibbard, Don Hunt, Jeff Laidlaw, Eric Langshaw, Chris Levy, Bob MacArthur, Jeff Ma, Janet Marsh, Rosemary Power, Dieter Rempel, Ed Russell, Jeff Williams, Hillary Young, Bo Cord, Heather McFadgen, and that's it.
So are there any final administrative comments?
Well, I was going to attempt to provide a summary of what we heard at the public hearing, but I think that that's probably unnecessary in this case, so we have no further comments.
So as long as you're there, I do have one last question for you. And there's a possible amendment that I would like to consider bringing, but which would require postponing first or second reading. But then, of course, if that were to happen, council could either support or not postpone it for that reason. But I'm a little hesitant just because of the project that you've mentioned. So if it was possible to postpone this to October 2nd, which is 1 week, what's your estimation of the impact of this specific water main loop project that might occur?
So unfortunately, I have not had the opportunity to confirm with engineering the exact timeline for essentially the expiry of the pricing confirmed through tender. So I don't know if we have essentially the room to delay until October 2nd or not. I can't answer that question this evening. Mr. Fish has suggested that, there could be a fairly easy amendment to the wording that council may wish to consider this evening, if that was council's desire. And that would be something to the effect of, notwithstanding the above, the requirement for an independent third-party review of an EIS does not apply to any EIS prepared by or on behalf of the town at the discretion of council.
That's essentially what I was thinking about.
Yes.
Could we put that on the overhead? Councillor Sanford?
Just a question about that. So that means that all EISs that are to be prepared on behalf of the town would have to come back to council for determination of aid. They would be dismissed, or they would need a third-party review, or there would be only an EIS required.
That is correct.
Is that sort of the three choices? Then you get three choices, not two.
That's correct. Essentially, we would have to determine some mechanism, either by bringing them to individual council meetings, or as Mr. Soto suggests, as part of the budget process, as part of the budget approval, basically indicating whether an EIS will be required, whether a third-party review would be required.
Okay, and do you see that causing delays in tendering projects or initiating projects or moving them forward?
So if we were able to do that through the budget process, I do not believe that should result in any delay of of required work. I believe that can be accommodated.
Okay, thank you.
Have we convened the public hearing?
Pardon me?
Have we?
We're still in
public hearing.
Final administrative comments.
Okay, sorry, I wasn't sure.
But perhaps I'll bring the public hearing to a close, and then what?
Because we're still in the administrative comment, I just wanted to point out very quickly, as I think council is aware, it was suggested in the public hearing that there was no tender of the third-party reviews, and there is a public tender for all of the third-party reviews. There is no public opening of the tenders, but there is a tender process by which they are sought.
No, as with any other tender process, that's there's a legal process that has to be observed.
That is correct.
Correct.
Thank you. So at this time then I'll adjourn the public hearing. And move on to item F1, the MDP Amendment Third Party Environmental Impact Statement. Mr.
Mayor Borman, members of council. Given as we have just discussed this, I will not repeat my presentation. I would like to make a comment, though, to address, so some of the concerns that we heard from the public leading up to this was the concern around moving directly to second and third reading immediately following the public hearing. So I would like to spend a moment to address that. So this is a practice that is very common and employed by municipalities throughout Alberta. It is completely consistent within the MGA, and it's generally done as a matter of administrative efficiency. So in order to ensure streamlined timelines and to minimize the impact on resources, both council and staff, it is often the case that a second, third reading will occur immediately following the close of a public hearing. Obviously, scheduling it in that way in no way fetters council's discretion in terms of what decision they decide to make, either to approve or to deny the matter before them, or to request additional work or to delay the vote. It is simply a matter of efficiency to schedule it in that way and then to allow council to make their decision. So council has the full opportunity and discretion to make any decision they like. They can approve, they can deny, or they can postpone the matter. Administration is of the opinion that this is a methodology that we should be applying more often for minor amendments to things like the land use bylaw or the MDP that are small in scope in order to improve efficiency. For larger scope items, it's not generally a practice that we would look to employ, given the fact that they are more complex and require more time for consideration. But for things that are very narrow in scope and straightforward, this is a practice that we will look to use more frequently in the future, we would like to suggest. Sure, and on that point, I recall several occasions where there has been the situation with a public hearing and no scheduling of second, third reading on the agenda, and yet there was no input at the public hearing, either written or verbal at all. Because often we have to follow this process on very small matters, that only because there's no requirement under the MGA to follow this process if it's doing X, Y, or Z. Right. Yeah. So it's certainly been a number of occasions where it would have been beneficial to simply go immediately to second and third reading. Yeah. I mean, ultimately, council makes the decision that they make when they feel they have sufficient information to make that decision. And if they feel they have sufficient information immediately following a public hearing, then they may choose to make the decision at that time. If they require additional information or more time, then they have the discretion to allow for that to occur. So this is not meant to predispose what the outcome may be, or preclude additional work, or in any way limit public input onto a matter. Just in regards to the written report that you had provided, on the second page of the report, you note, well, it's from the EIS itself, section 6. It notes the terms of reference for an EIS will be developed by administration with input from the qualified professional. And that qualified professional, so the process, if I understand, is the town hires a professional consultant to provide an EIS and works with that professional to actually define the terms of reference? Yeah, so when the wording of the MDP was put into place, I believe that only the scenario of essentially reviewing a developer's work was contemplated. So we hadn't put our minds to the situation where it would be a town-only development. However, your point is correct in that the town administration are required to work with a qualified professional. So in the case of a private development coming forward, we would work with a qualified professional third-party reviewer to define the terms of reference and review the work of the developer's consultant. In the instance of a town-led project, we would hire a qualified professional to work with to define the terms of reference and to implement the EIS. In both cases, we would be requiring a qualified professional to do the work. My recollection over more recent years is both the town and private sector have found at times quite a challenge in finding a qualified consultant that was prepared to get involved in work here in the town of Canmore. And I might remind council that prior to the recent MDP updates that occurred in 2016, there was a time when we required the town and the developer to jointly choose a consultant, and that At times, that led to a very difficult situation as well, where the two parties could not agree on who the consultant should be. And so we certainly believe that the current wording is an improvement over that scenario, and we are suggesting simply this minor amendment to put before council the consideration for when the town is the developer, which, like I said, we do not believe we had put our minds to when this wording was put together in the first place.
Before we get into a motion, I just want to note a typo in the blue line copy of the EIS in 6.1. In the proposed new wording, the last sentence talks about the town shall work with the EIS consultant to development. The terms of reference, it should be develop. But I will leave that as an editorial observation.
We can certainly make that change. So with that, the recommendation before council is that council give second and third reading to bylaw 2018-16, third-party environmental review impact statement. In this case, it would be as amended. And that council approve policy PD 003, environmental impact statement policy as amended.
And you're suggesting that this, in the red font, could be an amendment that we would have to add in?
That is correct. That my recommendation is the original wording, because I believe that that is a sufficiently robust process. If council feels that that is not a sufficiently robust process and that they wish the decision about whether or not to have a third-party reviewer to come to council in each instance, then this is wording that could satisfy that concern of council. But to be clear, the administrative recommendation is that this wording is unnecessary.
And if this is where council should end up going, this would allow for council to weigh in on that need at the capital project approval stage.
Yes, it's at council discretion, so administration would be required to seek council's input anytime the scenario would come forward.
So
the mechanism which could be determined by council.
Okay. Hate changing things on the fly.
Once again, you have the discretion if you do not feel you have sufficient information this evening.
Actually, there is no point of order from the audience.
Yeah, well, because this is vastly different materially from what was advertised, what we discussed, due to the fact that it's three authorities, three people could be instead of two people could be, nor
yeah, Mr. Kendi, I'm going to ask Mr. Kendi. Mr. Kendi, thank you. So this time, Councilor McCallum?
Is the motion down yet?
Pardon me?
Is the motion down yet?
I was just about to put a motion.
Okay, thank you.
I'll move the council give second reading to bylaw 2018-16 municipal development amendment third-party environmental impact statement. And I was going to move a postponement of that motion to the October 2nd meeting, which is next week, and have it appear on the agenda without a staff report. Just for, to give council a week to consider some of what we've heard today, and particularly this possibility. But I'd like to note that postponing motion can be voted against if council, by and large, is prepared to vote on the proposed motion that was in the agenda at this time. It's just a matter of voting against the postponing motion. So, did I put the postponing motion forward? Yes, I did. Councillor Sanford.
Well, Mayor, I won't support your motion because I think we've thoroughly considered aspects of this issue, and I think with the amendment that's been proposed, it gives us the security and comfort that we have 3 choices now when it comes to town-led projects for EIS, and I think that's a good direction to go, and we have opportunities during the capital budget to highlight and flag those.
That's not on the table quite
Okay,
yet.
well, I'm not in favor of postponement, so I won't vote in favor.
Okay, just to be clear, this suggestion of adding at the discretion of council is not yet the case. Councillor Seeley.
Yeah, I think we have enough information to move forward, so I want to be in favor of postponing tonight.
Councillor McCallum.
I would support your motion to postpone. I normally have wondered why actually in past we've not gone to second and third reading in certain cases. This would most normally be a situation where I would consider it, but I think actually the amendment that is being considered by council could be better. And I would like a week to think that one through and perhaps get some input from my colleagues. And so I'll support your postponing motion, Your Worship.
Councillor Comfort.
I will also support your motion simply because I haven't had time to read all of the submissions that the clerk read out, and I wouldn't feel that I had given fair hearing to the people who wanted their voices to be heard. So I'm okay with it going a week.
Anybody else speaking to the postponing motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question then on the postponement. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried with Councillor Seeley and Sanford in opposition. We'll move on then to item G1, Mountain Haven Cooperative Homes Unit Acquisition.
Postpone, excuse me. I'm just wondering if you would also like to postpone recommendation number 2. I know there was no discussion on that, but I suppose...
Yeah, that would be inherent in the motion, but yes, we'll have to call them postponing motion, postponement on that.
Okay, we'll just leave that as administrative detail.
Okay. Mr. Fark.
Good evening once again, Mayor Borum and members of council. So the next item on the agenda relates to Mountain Haven Cooperative Housing. The motion before you is that council approve a transfer of $4.245 million to CCHC from the PAH Reserve for the purpose of acquiring 17 rental units from Mountain Haven Cooperative Homes. So a little bit of history for about how we got here. So the housing cooperative is located in the Three Sisters area, almost right across the street from my house. There are 44 units, of which 27 are what they call equity, which means they are independently owned, and 17 which are non-equity, and those are units held by the cooperative as a total. So they are, the cooperative itself owns those 17 units. This was an independent project that was developed quite some time ago, but with strong links to both the town and CCHC. The town provided or funneled grant funding from the province through to support the implementation of this project, and the land is actually land that is leased from CCHC. So for all intents and purposes, administration considers this to be an affordable housing project supported by the town of Canmore. The current situation is that Mountain Haven is facing foreclosure. This is due to a myriad of historical issues, including some grant restrictions that were quite onerous, some problems with the management structure, etc. MCE, or Mountain Haven Co-op, the town and CCHC have been working collaboratively to try to reach a solution to the situation for quite some time. However, unfortunately, recent events have overtaken our abilities to find a workable solution. So a notice of foreclosure was received by the first mortgage holder, and that is Service Credit Union, in August. And in order to prevent foreclosure from occurring, Mountain Haven sent a letter of intent to CCHC offering to sell the 17 non-equity units to CCHC in order to satisfy the service debt. On September 18th of this year, the CCHC board met and passed a motion to accept the purchase of units at a price that we will discuss shortly, and my understanding is that that offer has been accepted by Mountain Haven. So this is not the first time that this matter has been before council. It's been fairly present over the last couple of years. So in April of 2017, council approved a motion to give first reading to a loan and guarantee bylaw to extend a loan to Mountain Haven. In that case, eventually, when it came to second reading, council defeated that motion and did not give second reading to that loan bylaw. And that happened on June 20th. But also on June 20th, council approved a motion to direct administration to work with CCHC and Mountain Haven to determine the feasibility of acquiring 17 non-equity units from MCHC to be transitioned to the CCHC PAH program. The final motion that is of interest to you is obviously on June 5th of this year, council authorized the transfer of $250,000 from the PAH reserve, and that was meant to fund the transition of the housing development from a co-op to a condominium corporation. So, speaking to that history, over the last couple of years, there were a couple of previous offers by CCHC to purchase the 17 units from Mountain Haven. Unfortunately, those offers were rejected. And the result of that was the creation of a technical committee to determine the value of the units. Also, as part of that process, the technical committee went through and developed what we are calling a roadmap. And that roadmap would allow the units to be sold with qualified title, which is essentially free of creditors' claims and in sufficiently good condition, no longer a co-op, condominium corporation, etc., to allow lenders to lend, buyers to buy, essentially clear title. Because of the history with this project and the fact that it is on CCHC leased lands and the town considers it a affordable housing project, the decision was taken by the technical committee that the resale value formula that CCHC applies for their own units should be applied. And just to remind council of what that is, so CCHC determines essentially a build cost. Presently that number is $275 a square foot. And so that is the build cost. And then, so clients of CCHC can, generally speaking, buy new units from CCHC when they become available at that price of $275 a square foot. At a later date, should they choose to sell it, they are able to sell it at the build cost multiplied by 110% of CPI annually, and that sets the maximum resale value. So it is not a guaranteed resale price, it is only a maximum resale value. So in theory, the units could in fact sell for less. As of November 1st, 2018, the maximum resale value according to this formula of the 17 units being considered is $4,210,704. So, avoiding foreclosure. The loans that CCHC has with service are what are qualified as demand loans, and they are payable at the request of the lender. So they are not for a fixed term. They are essentially, anytime the lender feels they need to be repaid, they can demand repayment of the loan. Service currently considers Mountain Haven in default of the loan conditions for a number of reasons, and as such has taken steps to move on foreclosure. There are significant costs and uncertainty involved in a foreclosure process, especially in any case. Anytime you enter a foreclosure process, it is uncertain and comes with costs. Particularly in the case of Mountain Haven, there is a long and very complex history with a number of different agreements that come into play here, and different creditor claims and rights that would need to be sorted out, and that adds a great deal of complication to the process. So avoiding the foreclosure process avoids a very long and costly legal process that could also potentially put in jeopardy the retention of the units as affordable, and it potentially puts at risk the homes of the equity owners as well, those other 27 units. So in order to essentially prevent or avoid foreclosure, as I indicated, Mountain Haven sent a letter of intent to CCHC offering to sell the units at $4,210,000, which is essentially the maximum resale value. The CCHC board countered, and they went back and they offered to purchase the units at $3,860,704,000, which, as coincidence would have it, is exactly $350,000 less. And in addition to that, they have offered Mountain Haven a loan, interest-free, for on a 10-year term of $350,000 to fund the reserve fund. And the reason for that is that currently the Mountain Haven has no reserve fund, and as a transition to a condominium corporation, they will be required to have a reserve fund in place, and certainly no lender would lend and no buyer would buy in a complex without a reserve fund. Given all of that, unfortunately, Mountain Haven has total liabilities that are $4.8 million. So they exceed essentially what is being offered and what has been accepted as the purchase price for the units. The difference to be made up is the combination of debt forgiveness that Mountain Haven will be responsible for negotiating with their creditors, and potentially contributions from Mountain Haven's own members. CCHC and the technical committee have actually acquired independent appraisals to verify and validate the value of the units in both an encumbered and unencumbered scenario. So encumbered being with all of the CCHC PAH restrictions in place, and unencumbered being if they were just sold on the free market, which is essentially what Service would be attempting to do should they be successful through the foreclosure process. In both cases, the value does exceed the agreed upon sale price. In terms of alternatives and financial impacts, Council could decline to fund the purchase and allow foreclosure with the intent to acquire the units after foreclosure. Under the current scenario, Mountain Haven Co-op is responsible for going through the difficult process of clearing their debts with the remaining creditors other than Service. In a foreclosure process, Service would be responsible for clearing the other creditors off of title. That's certainly going to be a challenging process for Mountain Haven to go through. But at the end of the day, the units, when they become available through foreclosure, would certainly be guaranteed of clear title. This is not recommended by administration for a number of reasons. One is that the costs of the foreclosure process themselves, the proceeds of the sale of the units eventually go to offset the costs. So the more costs that you incur, the less money there is left over to satisfy the creditors. And so we don't believe that this process actually benefits the remaining creditors. As well, because of the uncertain nature of the legal process, we believe that both CCHC and the town would be in a position of needing to participate in the foreclosure process in order to ensure that our interests are represented. That will also be costly, and those are not costs that the town or CCHC could recover through the eventual acquisition of the units. And most importantly, Service is of the opinion that if they are successful in foreclosure, they can sell the 17 units on the market without any restrictions. So those units would be lost to the affordability portfolio. And the intent of this project all along is to provide affordable housing within our community. And based on council priorities, we do not believe that it is in the best interest of the town or CCHC to allow the loss of those units from the affordability portfolio. In terms of financial impacts, the current balance of the PAH reserve is $4.6 million. And CCHC, pursuant to their board motion, has sent a request to the town of Canmore, a transfer of $4.245 million, and that would fund the purchase of the units at $3.86. It would fund the loan of $350,000, and it would also cover the closing costs to CCHC, which generally run in the neighborhood of $1,000 to $1,500 a unit, depending on the complexity of the transaction. So the $4.245 million is sufficient to cover all three of those costs for CCHC in acquiring these units. Therefore, we come to the recommendation that Council approve a transfer of $4.245 million to CCHC from the PAH reserve for the purpose of acquiring 17 rental units from Mountain Haven Cooperative Homes. That concludes my presentation. I am happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you very much. First question is just in regards to the current PAH reserve, $4.6 million. That's quite a bit higher than the reserve usually sits at. Mm-hmm. Can you detail why it is that the reserve is at that level?
So council has a PAH acquisition or requisition on the tax every year that provides some recurring income to the PAH reserve. However, in the last couple of years, there have been two notable supplementary sources of revenue. One has been council has transferred significant funds from the operating reserve. So at the end of each year, there is generally speaking, or operating surplus, sorry, not reserve. There's generally speaking been a surplus over what was budgeted, and council has allocated funds from that surplus to the PAH reserve. And in addition, I believe it was last year, time just seems so hard to, yes. Some time ago, the town sold the one half of the Mustache to Northview REIT as part of a program to also deliver affordable housing. And from that, the town took proceeds of $2.7 million, of which I believe 2.2 was transferred to the PAH reserve and 500,000 was moved to the general capital reserve.
Yeah, and just as an observation, that revenue, the 2.2 that you referenced from Northview REIT, was for a piece of property that we exchanged with the province for the small piece of land behind the seniors lodge.
That is correct.
So if this current motion should carry forward, then the small piece of land behind the lodge will, which now has provided 60 new seniors house, pardon me? 63 new housing units for seniors and 149 market rental units.
Well, so on Palliser, you have 100 market rental units, you have 40 PAH rental units, and you have 40 beds of employee housing.
Right. And then ultimately, that same flow through could end up with Mountain Haven's an additional 17 units, actually 44 units at Mountain Haven's that would be in the PAH.
That's correct.
Pool. Preventing
foreclosure at Mountain Haven actually will ensure that all 44 units become part of the formal CCHC PAH program. So that is a considerable added benefit in terms of ensuring their affordability on a going forward basis. And then it is the intent of CCHC, which my understanding is to eventually resell those units again to their clients. So they would recoup that $4.245 million, and then they would be able to use that to further the next affordable housing development in the town.
Mm-hmm. So at that price, it would average out for those 17 units, as I make it, to about $265,000 per unit, which compares quite favorably with the value that Hawks Bend on the units we're
Yeah.
Just completing there.
Generally speaking, these units come in at a lower cost than some of the other units that have come through the PAH portfolio recently. And there is certainly a segment of the market that this type of product we believe would be very attractive to. So there are CCHC clients who would have liked to have purchased at Hawke's Bend, but who couldn't qualify for the mortgages there because even though they were affordable, they were on the higher end of the affordability scale. So this would certainly meet an additional need.
So, a couple of questions. If council approves this funding, there's still not complete certainty that the whole project will kick in.
No. So there are a number of conditions that were attached to the CCHC essentially agreement to purchase, which are now being enshrined in a purchase and sales agreement that the two parties will then need to agree on. And then those conditions will have to be met prior to closure. And there's no guarantee that those conditions can be met, although we are certainly optimistic that it is possible.
Yeah, as you noted, I think you noted the debt exceeds this amount of money.
It does.
So what would happen with the unaccounted for debt?
So as indicated in the staff report, the difference would have to be made up through a combination of debt forgiveness from some of the creditors other than Service. Service as first mortgager is not prepared to offer any debt forgiveness. And given that they would control the foreclosure process, they're really not required to. And then if there is a remaining deficit, then that would have to be covered through something like a cash call to the remaining members.
So if foreclosure were to proceed, clearly there would be a direct and very negative impact to the residents that are living in the 17 equity units.
In fact, it is our opinion, or the opinion of administration, that foreclosure benefits absolutely no one. It doesn't benefit Service, who would have to go through a long and complicated foreclosure process. So although they will eventually recover all of their money, it will take them a number of years to do so. It doesn't benefit the additional creditors because the foreclosure process adds costs that come out of the proceeds of the sale. And so there would be less funds available to those other creditors by virtue of that process. We don't believe it benefits the current 17 tenants of the non-equity units because their ownership and their future housing would be insecure. And we don't believe it benefits the 27 equity members who, in fact, the whole co-op and the nature of that entity would be called into question and could add serious complication to their ability to obtain financing, refinance, or eventually sell their properties. And once again, it doesn't benefit CCHC or the town because it puts at risk the ability to retain those units as affordable.
I understand from conversations at CCHC board, which I sit on, that after all of the units at Hawke's Bend have been sold, there's yet 112 qualified families looking for that are still on the wait list.
There is considerable remaining pent-up demand for purchase units through the PAH program. Absolutely, yes.
Do you know if any of those people on the wait list have any awareness that this project may open up at Mountain Havens?
It is my understanding that at least some of them are aware and that at least some of them have expressed some interest in potentially acquiring units. Again, with the proviso that a significant process still needs to be gone through to get them in a position where those units can actually be properly sold through the PAH program.
Are there any questions then for Mr. Fark at this time from council? Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, Mr. Fark, for that presentation as well. You said there's a process still outstanding for making those units saleable. At this point in time, they could stay in the rental. If they were purchased for CCHC, they could stay in rental.
That's correct. So there are both obligations under the Residential Tenancy Act to the current tenants. So there would be no immediate move to displace those tenants. So they would remain in place. And they would remain in place until such time as this process is complete. And then CCHC, who would acquire the units, takes decisions in terms of what their next steps might be.
And in order to subdivide this property and make it saleable, there's still a process, and is that process currently funded?
That process is currently funded, so that was the $250,000 that council previously allocated earlier this summer for that purpose. So what we need to do there is we need to do a condo conversion, we need to do a legal survey, we've already done a condition assessment and ensure that the building is up to code and is in good condition. So there are a number of works that need to be done still, but yes, that is funded and is in process.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. So, Mr. Fark, you noted at the beginning of your presentation that there were some, which I'm aware of, some overly restrictive grant restrictions, and it's my understanding that we've managed to make those go away.
Yes, the CAO, Lisa DeSoto, successfully managed to negotiate with the province to have the grant agreement amended so that the term has actually expired. So the conditions to meet the core needs income threshold, the SNIT as we used to call it, which was one of the main limiting factors, that is no longer in place.
Well, the core needs income threshold is actually the number that we used to use to measure people for low income or social housing. So
yes.
It was an interesting combination to begin with. That was my only question, just to make sure that that had gone away, because that was, in my opinion. Oh, one more question. Do we have an idea as to how many people who are actually in the equity units are bound to those units because they haven't been able to sell it because of this particular core needs income threshold and with the reserve issues?
So my understanding is that there are a number of owners currently who have been unable to purchase elsewhere, have been unable to either move out of the community or take jobs elsewhere or dispose of the unit because they're unsellable currently under the current conditions. And the exact number I don't know offhand, but it is a significant number.
Okay, thank you very much.
Councillor Comfort.
Yes, thanks for the presentation. I don't know if you can answer this question, in fact, but do we have any idea how long it will be before we need reserve dollars to start another PAH project? Is there any timeline on our planning? Or?
Right. So we discussed it, administration discussed with council at the last strategic planning session. There have been a number of significant developments recently that impact the market and the demand for housing. So the Hawke's Bend development was one, but we have the development at the Palliser lands. There are two other purpose-built rental buildings that recently have received approvals from council, development permit approvals from council, and that we anticipate will be moving forward. So although I cannot speak for CCHC, because CCHC of course, has the discretion to explore opportunities as they may see fit. The position of administration is that now is a good opportunity to pause for a brief period of time, likely to go through a process of updating the Community Housing Action Plan, and then understanding what the impacts of some of this housing has been on the market and on the demand for housing, and then using that as a basis to determine what the next priority project should be and what that should look like. I don't anticipate that that would conclude much before, at the earliest, this time next year. So I believe that we have time.
And I believe we're also waiting for the housing needs study to come forward and give us some more information.
Yes, and further to that, even, for example, the decision on the Olympics could potentially have some impact on timing and a decision around what type of development would be appropriate.
Okay, thank you.
And just one other note, Councillor, if this whole project should move forward, one of the likely outcomes for CCAC would be to resell the units, which over time, and our experience at Hawke's Bend was it wasn't a lot of time, would replenish the reserve up basically to the current amount. So there's a good reason to be expecting the reserve to be, short-term drawdown. Councillor Seeley.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just on the liabilities that are on the property, if everything else falls into line and just the liabilities are left, how quick do we need to work through that? Is that something that could go on for a long time? Because I'd rather see a quick ending to that as well.
It's not something that has a lot of time to be resolved. So the service has indicated a willingness to allow this process to move forward because, again, it's in their interest to get their money out now rather than have to go through a foreclosure process and wait to get it. However, their patience is not unlimited. And CCHC has indicated that they are looking to come to a quick conclusion to this as well. So the current target date is November 1st, is the date that is being targeted to finalize this process.
So is it also tied to a default? So if we can't fix that, does the whole thing fall apart?
That's a difficult question to answer. If it is not possible for Mountain Haven to come to a conclusion with their creditors, then yes, there is a serious risk that the project would then go into foreclosure.
Okay, thanks.
There's no further questions from members of council at this time. And I see none. Thank you very much, Mr. Fark. That I will move that council approve a transfer of $4,245,000 to CCHC from the PH Reserve for the purpose of acquiring 17 rental units from Mountain Haven Cooperative Homes. I'll speak in support of the motion. This is certainly an issue that's been the forefront of my mind and others at the town, well, since I was first elected in 2004. That's about when this project was struggling to be born, and I can recall meetings back then with a number of residents here with their families. There were emotional meetings in 2005 because the whole project was just struggling for a number of reasons, which were identified in the report. I won't go into them, but ever since then we've had up to 44 families living at Mountain Havens in an affordable situation, but always in a very tenuous affordable situation. And yet, in the mind of the community, Mountain Havens has always been seen to be a part of the town of Canmore and Housing Corporation's pool of controlled, perpetually affordable housing, which it has never been. This is an opportunity for us to resolve a number of issues, both for the residents of the building, the residents of Canmore, who some at times have lived in sort of daily fear of losing their home, resolving that in a very positive way for the community, and for the first time having those 44 units actually operated under the full criteria that applies to our perpetually affordable housing. And with more than 100 qualified families on the wait list after Hawks Bend has been sold, I have great confidence that if CCHC should decide to start marketing those Mountain Havens units, if they're able to acquire them, there would be some strong uptake on that. And I'll note that at the purchase price has been discussed, the average unit, the average of the 17 units would value at about $265,000, which certainly compared to average housing in Canmore is very affordable, and even compared to the Hawks Bend project is quite affordable. So after years, I'm happy to support this motion and hope that we bring this nasty chapter to a close. Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. I was just going back to through my notes to find out when we first discussed this, and it looks like it was in April of 2017. So we've gone almost 18 months, and it's been a lot of elbow grease and work on behalf of the CCHC board and in behalf of the Mountain Haven Co-op Housing Corp. But what I didn't realize until you just said it, Your Worship, was that this goes back to 2004. So these folks have been having this wrench in their guts for about 14 years. I don't even want to know what their guts look like right now. So I will be happy to support this motion. I feel that this deal is both fair and prudent on behalf of the town as well as for Mountain Haven Co-op. We will be acquiring 17 units that we can, in turn, once the process is complete, sell to qualified PAH applicants. And we know that On that list of 112, I believe 25% of them are directly in the ballpark to be able to afford these units. So we know that there is an audience there waiting for them to be released. I do agree that these have always been seen as affordable housing, and it would be good to secure that through this whole process. But at the end of the day, we do realize that Mountain Haven has their own elbow grease to continue to do after this, and so I wish them luck. Again, I will be sticking my hand up in the air when this comes forward in a few minutes. Thank you.
Councillor Stanford.
Thank you, Worship. Well, I think I will happily support this endeavor to get these 17 rental units into the CCHC fold. I'd have to commend CCHC and administration for the hard work that they've done on this file, because this has taken a long time. I know we started talking about this on council, but it's been talked about in the community and on previous councils for much longer than my term. But I know that we've gone to a couple of different scenarios to try and resolve this issue, but I think what's being offered here is fair and reasonable, and the fact that the money's in the reserve and available to use for this purpose, and that you've come up with a good package to offer, and hopefully Mountain Haven Co-op can do their work on their end and complete this deal, and I think we'll see some good affordability in the community. And under the CCHC affordability criteria, it will allow more people to purchase these units and still maintain that affordability criteria. So thank you very much. I will support it.
Councillor Seeley.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'll also support this motion and hope for a successful outcome. It provides an opportunity for the Mountain Haven residents to move forward with a CCHC managed solution, so I will support the motion.
Councillor Hillstead.
I will also be supporting this motion. It'll help keep affordability in the Mountain Haven Co-op 44 unit project, so it's just good to keep affordability where we can, and hopefully we won't lose any of the units for foreclosure.
There's no further discussion on the motion. I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Just before we move on, I do want to extend my sincere thanks and the thanks of council to not only the board of CCHC, who have worked their collective souls to the bone. This has been an excruciating series of conversations at the board, but particularly recognize Dan Sparks' contribution. He's sat as a volunteer on a separate negotiating committee with Mr. Fark and Mr. Forteeth. They're at least being paid to do that work, and Mr. Sparks isn't. And on behalf of council and the board, Dan, thanks for everything you've been doing on this file. Pardon me? And of course our CAO, but so at this time then I will move council go in camera to prevent disclosure of third-party information in accordance with section 16(1) of the Freedom of Information Protection and Privacy Act. We're in camera. Adjourned.
See ya.